Good morning. This is Monday, February the 12th, and I'm Ron. Welcome to Storytime. And today's the Storytime Extra, and I wanted to talk about a time where I spent about 6 months in working for a police department. It was a temporary job. I've done a whole lot of different things. I was thinking the other day, a whole lot of different jobs in my life. I mean, a whole bunch. And one of these days I'm going to write them down. But for 6 months, when I was temping, I ended up as a clerk in a police department, a temporary clerk. And one of the things I wanted to let people know about, particularly those people that are conservative in nature, is the ease and with which police officers lie. They lie and feel free to lie to anyone. There was a Supreme Court ruling years ago in which I believe it was some type of suspect or a criminal, I think, somebody that had been convicted of a crime that sued, saying that this person ended up in jail because the police department lied to them. And I believe it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said the police officers are not under any obligation to tell the truth. No obligation to tell the truth. That's something to think about. And while I was there, one of an excellent example of this, and then it seems also that the police officers, maybe because of that ruling, lie to anybody and everybody, because they can. So, an example of this, I was part of my jobs as a clerk was file police reports, and I came across a particular report that had with it a lineup card, which is a card that has the mugshots mugshots of a variety of different people, and the idea is for the victim or the witness to pick out the offender out of this lineup card and identify the individual involved. So, in this particular lineup card was of women. There was about, I don't know, let's say 8 of them, approximately. And one of the pictures was circled, and near the circle was written the words, "She's the one." And so when I read the report, the police officer in question had confronted this particular female suspect, with the lineup card that was circled and had "She's the one" written on it, and uh, said that the victim had looked at this lineup card and picked her out. And so the suspect didn't flinch. She, just kind of shrugged her shoulders, and had nothing to say. And so the police officer, I don't know, gave some kind of stern warning or whatever, and let her go. And in the report, and this is all in the report, the officer states that the victim actually could not identify the offender here, and the female offender could not identify them, and that the officer had gone ahead and circled the picture and written "She's the one." For whatever reason, the officer felt that this lady was the perpetrator, and had circled it and wrote on it "She's the one," and presented it to this lady. And so, anyways, so it's a blatant. In other words, he flagrantly blatant lied. He lied to this woman about the circumstances of this particular lineup card. And what's interesting about this is I wonder how many times people have confessed, and maybe have confessed to a crime not because they actually did it, but because of the psychological pressure put on them by such a tactic. Can you imagine that? You haven't done anything, but maybe you look like the person that is, um, that's a perpetrator. You get maybe asked to come to the police department. You're presented with this piece of evidence. Hey, we have eyewitness statement or a victim statement. A lineup card that shows, where the victim has said basically, you're the one that committed the crime. Can you imagine the psychological pressure? Now you're in a position where you have to try to prove you didn't. And if you don't have evidence of your whereabouts at the time, witnesses, something of that nature, uh, you're in a lot of trouble. You're under a lot of pressure at that particular point to come up with a confession. And I again wonder how many people have confessed under such circumstances and confessed falsely. And the police departments and the police officers that use this particular technique are, of course, counting on the fact that only the guilty will confess, that people that are not guilty will never, of course, confess. And I don't think that's the way it's going to work. Another situation was on television, a television program where a police officer, an escapee, somebody had escaped from prison and was fleeing. And a police officer happened to, they were out doing a dragnet, so to speak, and they were out looking for this guy. And the police officer stops this man who's out walking around and who looks like the escapee, and then um, asks him for identification. He doesn't have any, etc. Well, wait a second here. Stay here for a second. I got to go back to the radio and check and see whether or not there's any wants or warrants or what's going on with you. So he gets on the radio and or pretends, actually. I don't think he even got on the radio, or pretended to, and then he comes back and he says, "Oh, bad news. You're the guy." And the man again didn't flinch, because the test is, of course, if he says you're the one you're the escapee, then apparently the individual would they're assuming that the individual would flee. He would take off running, and that would give them the indication that they're on the right track and go ahead and make the arrest. But this guy didn't flinch. He played it cool, and the officer let him go. And it turned out, of course, that he was indeed the escapee. So it didn't work. I mean, that's the other part of this. The whole idea of lying to people is that might makes right and the ends justify the means, which is not true. And here's a couple of situations in which I think at least in the one particular situation where the man actually was an escapee, but their little test failed, um, it demonstrates that it doesn't even work, and that might doesn't make right anyways, and the ends never justify the means. So um, that was again just an interesting little. It's and again because conservatives, I think, have a tendency to think that police officers have this kind of a 1950s kind of viewpoint of police officers and police work, kind of naive. That police officers are basically Boy Scouts with guns. They're not going to do anything bad. They're not going to put anybody's freedom or liberty in jeopardy. They're not going to take unnecessary risks. They're not going to believe that the ends justify the means and might makes right. They're always going to play fair, and they're going to play by the rules, and they don't. So I think a lot of times it's not necessarily because a lot of people think that they want to keep their arrest records, keep the statistics, keep all the statistics good. But I think it's just a lot of times it's just zeal. You dealing with victims and people that have been harmed in various ways, shape, and form, and you want, as a police officer, to do something about it. You want to help them. You want to see these people get justice. And in your zeal to try to get them justice, you're uh, doing what you think of as cutting corners and um, yeah, cutting corners and again, it gets back to might makes right and the ends justify the means, that it's okay for you to lie to people because you're trying to get justice for a crime victim. And it isn't. And it doesn't work. The other thing that it occurred to me also, I noticed that there are individuals that go to prison, usually for murder, and years later, decades later, they're exonerated. There is a certain, I think they're lawyers, groups of lawyers that I think one of them is called the Innocence Project, and they go and in certain cases, when the inmate can make the case that he or she is innocent, they will investigate and try to prove that this person didn't do it, usually by with DNA and whatnot. But it seems to me, then how is it if because several people lately have been exonerated and taken out of jail after sometimes 20 or 30 years. They're the person that didn't commit a rape or didn't commit a robbery, and it's proven with DNA. Then how? And the police still claim that the individual is guilty, even though this person, goes through and has a court vacate the sentence, and they very often end up getting compensation from the city or the state, millions of dollars to compensate them for being wrongfully imprisoned for 20 or 30 years. And yet, police departments continue to say, no, we made no mistake, we did nothing wrong, and the individual you're letting out is a killer. And how the individual then ended up in prison in the first place. My thinking on it is that the police department interviews a suspect sometimes that they're not sure. Maybe they've got evidence against him, but they're not 100% sure. But they know the individual that they're talking to either did it or knows who did it. So they tell him, look, we got the goods on you. We've got the evidence against you to convict you of this crime. And if you know who did it, this is the time for you to come forward, tell us who did it, and we'll go ahead and arrest that individual and put them in prison. And because the individual doesn't want to snitch, they say nothing. Sorry, I don't know anything. I don't know who did it. Police department is convinced that this person does know who did it, and basically it becomes like a bluffing game. Police department says, we'll go ahead and we got enough evidence against you to prosecute you, so either produce the real killer or we will prosecute you. And the individual decides they're not going to be a snitch, and so the police department presents evidence to the district attorney, who goes ahead and prosecutes and successfully convicts this individual, and ends up prosecuting and convicting them of a crime they didn't commit. And that it is later on, when through DNA evidence, that they're able to come up with the real killer, and the individual is freed, and the individual is freed without having to snitch. So I think that's my theory on how this kind of thing happens, because I don't believe that the police departments are just willingly grabbing somebody off the street and saying, knowing that they're not had nothing to do with the crime, and just trumping up evidence against them to throw them in prison. It just doesn't make any sense to me that way. So, but anyways, that's my little extra for today. Tomorrow I will be back to doing some reading, and that's going to be from Ayn Rand's book called The Virtue of Selfishness. And until then, thank you very much for joining me, and have a great day.